Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Power Summit 2021. We're at a critical point in history. We've entered a decisive decade. Not only for our sector, not only for Europe, but for all mankind. If we fail, the objectives of the Paris Agreement will be definitively out of reach. So I say, let's try. And if we succeed, I am absolutely convinced that we will have a fascinating, roaring electric decade. This is the topic of this year's summit, this decisive decade that is in front of us. And I am thrilled and honored by the interest that we've experienced and the participation that we have at this summit. Heads of state, vice presidents, ministers, industry captains, civil society leaders and thought leaders, all joining us to commit, to contribute, and to discuss how we can make this electric decade a success. Now, this morning, we're going to have a number of keynote interventions. We have a whole range of exciting interviews and interventions for you, but the very first one is from our outgoing president, Pat O'Doherty, who is the CEO of ESB in Ireland. So without further ado, over to you in the studio in Dublin.
Good morning and welcome to Ireland. My name is Gráinne Seoige. I'm a journalist and TV broadcaster, and I'm joined here in Dublin this morning by Pat O'Doherty, Chief Executive of Ireland's state-owned electricity utility ESB and President of Eurelectric. Good morning, Pat.
Good morning, Gráinne.
Pat, you joined the board of Eurelectric in 2012 and you became part of the presidency team in 2019. In that 7 years, what were the big changes you noticed in the energy sector?
It's been a real privilege for me to have been appointed President of Eurelectric, and my role as President is to build on the work of successive presidents about placing electricity very much centre stage in the decarbonisation agenda. There's been huge changes in the last 10 years. I suppose when I think about it, I go back over the last 10 years, we were talking about renewables, talking about energy efficiency, encouraging customers to use less electricity seems strange.
Yeah.
All the technical things, all looking inside and into the industry and into our companies. But what's happened in the last 4 years or so is we've begun to see the power of electricity and its transformative role in climate action. And we've begun now from decarbonising our own industry and getting it ready. We now look at the role that our industry can play in decarbonising the economy, the wider economy. So that by 2050, we could expect through electrification, we could expect to see 80% of the carbon removed from the European economy purely by electrification.
It's amazing, isn't it? Climate change, decarbonisation, it's on the news agenda constantly, and electricity is right in the centre of that.
It is. There isn't a government climate action plan in Europe that doesn't have electricity and electrification, particularly electrification of heat and transport, as part of its master plan for climate action. Mm-hmm. And for 100 years, electricity has been at the heart of societal well-being. It's been an enabler of societal and economic well-being. And this is the second coming now of electricity. It places electricity right at the heart of a societal transformation around saving the planet.
The other factor, I suppose, that has transformed society in the last year in particular is COVID-19. We've all been touched and affected by it. How have you reacted to that in the electricity sector, and how has the electricity sector played a part in dealing with the challenges that COVID has brought?
The power sector right across Europe has stood up to be counted in COVID, but that doesn't surprise me, because one thing we do well is we actually do crisis and emergency. We plan for that. For example, in ESB, our first pandemic crisis management plan was done in the back of SARS in 2006. But also the electricity system has proven to be extremely resilient. That's because of the investments that have been made down the decades, but also investment in capability. Our people are very much at the heart of what we do. We all realised too with COVID, all businesses realised COVID has given a greater connection with purpose of business. That's what we've seen in electricity. The response to COVID, the societal response to COVID, homes now are places of work. They're where we live. They're where we go to school, and we're colleges. So electricity is at the heart of all of that, and also the medical response to COVID also all depends on electricity. So it's put electricity very, very much centre stage, and it's allowed us as an industry to reconnect with our purpose.
What you're doing and enabling people to work from home, to go to school from home, it's a great privilege and a responsibility at the same time.
Yes, but I suppose when I look back on the role that electricity has played, it's a 100-year-old sector. It's about creating that economic and societal well-being is what we do. We have learned so much about ourselves during COVID. And one of the things we have to take COVID, when we go back, we'll go back to something different. And in ESB, we talk about going back to something better. We're going backward, but we're not going backwards. And I think what we've all learned from COVID is how governments and society has responded. So now what we should do is take that into the response around climate action and climate change and build on that and learn from that.
So you run kind of diagnostics and you analyse what's been happening and then take a step forward from that.
Yeah, like what we've seen in COVID is the whole of government's response, leaving no stone unturned to deal with a pandemic. So climate change, is it any different from a pandemic? And what we need is the same kind of mobilisation, the same kind of esprit de corps, the same togetherness about it.
This Eurelectric conference is called the Electric Decade. Sounds great, almost sounds like a disco song or something. What does it mean though, and why is it important?
You know, if the last decade was about positioning the electricity sector and positioning electricity, this is the decade about doing. So we can see now the ramp up of climate action. We can see US under President Biden now coming to the table, the US Sino deal, COP in Glasgow. You know, everything now is putting climate action centre stage. Also, the role of electricity and the role of electrification is becoming centre stage. When it's realised now what electricity can do. So we're going to have 50 million heat pumps, we're going to have 70 million electric vehicles. We can see the shift actually taking place before our very eyes. For the last decade we talked about upcoming change. We're now in the change. We're living that change. And that's what's really, really exciting. That's the opportunity that presents itself to us as a sector. And if we step up and grasp it, then this is about our future. It's about our future as a sector.
Absolutely. What's your message to the European electricity industry as you pass on the baton to the new incoming president?
So I think there's a big job of work to do around collaboration. This is a huge societal transformation. It's a huge systems transformation. So it needs to bring together regulators, the utility sector, the policymakers, academia, technology providers, all working together in a joined up way to make this happen. The second thing we need to put the customer very much centre stage, because as I said, customer is going to make choices around how they deploy these new technologies. And we need to design this whole new system. I talk about reimagining the power sector, the power system, and we need to do this with the customer very much centre stage. And lastly, we need to do this in a way that is inclusive for all customers, inclusive for everybody. As utilities, we are changing the way we do things. Some of our old technologies and our old ways of doing things are going. People, that has implications for jobs. We will create new jobs. But this is happening across all sectors. So there's an inclusion piece around that, this just transition. but also inclusion to make sure that whatever way we do this, that all customers can afford to do this and everybody can afford to partake in the transition.
Exciting times ahead, Pat.
Very much so.
Pat O'Doherty, thank you so much.
Thank you, Grania.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you for the excellent cooperation during your presidency. It is now my honor and privilege to introduce to all of you the Irish Prime Minister, An Taoiseach, Micheál Martin.
Díomh, ba bhfuil an fáilte a chu roimh go léir chuig cruinniú mollaigh cuachtach electric 2021 aspaile á clia éire. I would like to welcome you all to the 2021 Euro Electric Power Summit from Dublin, Ireland. Thanks to the organisers and to ESB, Ireland's Electricity Supply Board, whose Chief Executive, Pat O'Doherty, has served as President of Euroelectric over the last year. We have witnessed the world turn upside down in the last year due to COVID-19 pandemic. It has made us reassess what is important to us in the face of unexpected and frightening circumstances. Our connection to each other, as well as our resilience and sense of responsibility, have all been challenged. Re-engagement with our own local environments in the past year, be it local parks, beaches, hills, or other green spaces, has reconnected many people with nature and heightened public awareness of the importance of protecting and preserving our environment. Our connection with each other was facilitated by digital platforms and technology, which helped us maintain our relationships, our work, and our social lives. Clearly, these connections, or the platforms that enable them, could not have been maintained without a reliable electricity supply to our homes and workplaces. Our resilience as a global community was dependent on collaborations and partnerships, and will continue to be, whether we are facing public health crisis or the climate crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic remains the immediate challenge, but we cannot lose sight of other challenges. The climate crisis remains the great existential crisis of our time, and tackling it in a meaningful way is a key priority for me and for this government. The theme of this summit is the electric decade, marking the 2020s as the decade for digital and decarbonised electrification. The pandemic has accelerated our move towards a more digital future, but this needs to be supported by sustainable green energy. Clean electricity can not only help deliver our necessary emissions reduction targets, but also provide new jobs, economic recovery, and a more resilient, secure, and sustainable energy system for future generations. As a country, Ireland has made significant progress towards the deployment of renewable electricity. Under the 2020 EU Energy and Climate Framework, we set a target to generate 40% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2020. Ireland's share of electricity generated by renewables increased to nearly 38% in 2019. Though we await the final publication of renewable energy statistics for 2020 later this year, I understand that we came very close to our 40% target. Ireland is a world leader at incorporating large amounts of wind-generated electricity onto the network. We were third worldwide in our use of wind energy in 2018, after Denmark and Uruguay. However, Ireland as an island nation has some unique challenges in our power infrastructure. We currently have limited connection to the rest of Europe to import or export energy. Despite this, our grid system has been sufficiently flexible to incorporate increasing amounts of renewables, balancing a variety of different energy sources while also adapting to changing power demands as technology developed in homes, industry, and other sectors. As an island nation, we also have unique opportunities. Given our location at the Atlantic edge of the European Union, and with sea area 10 times that of our land mass, Ireland has very promising offshore renewable energy potential. Our sea area contains both shallow waters in the Irish Sea and deeper waters off our west coast, meaning we offer very significant opportunities for both fixed and floating offshore wind turbine technologies. These technologies must play a key role in achieving our increasingly ambitious renewable electricity targets. To facilitate this, the Government hopes to soon enact our new consenting regime under the Maritime Area Planning Bill. This regime will aim to provide clarity and consistency for applicants, attract investment and ensure that offshore renewable energy projects are in line with state environmental and marine spatial planning policy. The first offshore renewable energy support scheme auction is also planned to launch in 2021, providing a clear route to market for the offshore renewable energy industry. We've also achieved a tremendous amount to date in other areas of renewables. Since 2015, the amount of coal burned to generate electricity has reduced by 85%, and this has contributed to a 13% reduction in greenhouse gases in Ireland since 2005. The first renewable electricity support scheme, or principal policy measure to increase the deployment of renewable electricity, took place in July of 2020 and resulted in 68 successful projects. This scheme not only delivers on our clean power objectives, but also ensures that communities and citizens are included and empowered in the energy transition. It provides financial support for community-led projects, mandatory community benefit funds, investment opportunities, and additional community categories for future auctions. While there have been successes in Ireland so far, there is, of course, still much more to be done. Last December, the heads of government of all the European Union member states agreed to increase the European Union-wide commitment to greenhouse gas emissions from 40% by 2030 to 55% by 2030. This European Union-wide approach aligns with our own domestic commitments outlined in our new Climate Action Bill. Our programme for government, agreed in June 2020, essentially doubles the climate ambition set out in the 2019 Climate Action Plan. We have committed to an average 7% per annum reduction in overall greenhouse gas emissions from 2021 to 2030, a 51% reduction over the decade, and to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. We have set a target of at least a 70% share of renewable electricity by 2030. We have made this commitment not only to decarbonise the electricity sector, but to facilitate the decarbonisation of the transport, heating and cooling sectors through electrification, including through the deployment of electric vehicles and heat pumps. To achieve this, huge change and investment is required on the supply side of emissions-producing sectors, while ensuring that people are empowered and enabled to make the right decisions on the demand side. And these changes are underway. In April 2021, in line with the government's ambition of reaching net zero emissions by 2050, the ESB announced Green Atlantic at Moneypoint. The ESB intention is that the Moneypoint site will be transformed into a renewable energy hub. This will help Ireland to become a leader in green energy production with the capacity to power 1.6 million homes. The Celtic Interconnector is a €1 billion electricity interconnector linking Ireland to France, due to be completed in 2026. The project will provide access to the European internal energy market. It will also enhance security of electricity supply and facilitate increased capacity for renewable energy via export access to the mainland European markets. Green hydrogen could also play a key role in Ireland's future energy system and meeting our targets for 2030 and beyond. As we move towards our 2030 target of 70% renewable electricity, there will be times at which available renewable electricity significantly exceeds demand. This excess renewable electricity could be used to produce hydrogen. The programme for government recognises the importance of researching and developing green hydrogen as a zero-emission energy source, particularly in difficult to decarbonise sectors such as freight, aviation and industry. The role of green hydrogen and the actions needed for its development are being considered as part of the development of the next Climate Action Plan. All of these high ambitions need to be met with supply chain development and ensuring that the Irish workforce possesses the right skills and abilities. There is ample opportunity for reskilling towards green jobs in energy sectors, with centres of excellence being established across Ireland this year to upskill workers in relevant construction and infrastructure skills. A new Climate Action Plan 2021, due to be published this summer, will include additional policies and measures in every sector to bring about the significant changes needed to transform our society. It will be strong on implementation and cross-collaboration across all sectors. Finally, it is not enough to only look inward. Domestic and European climate action needs to be matched with an intensification of diplomacy and climate financing if we are to make a meaningful contribution to limiting the impacts of climate change at home and abroad. If we want to achieve the objectives set out in the Paris Agreement, the international community needs to act rapidly, strongly and consistently. The European Union plays an important role in shaping the global agenda. The Green New Deal and important agreements such as the EU-India Clean Energy and Climate Partnership are examples of the cooperation that needs to happen at a global scale to accelerate innovation in this area. I'm delighted to see events like today where the European power industry takes stock and looks to how it will address the challenges ahead and maximise on opportunities. And I am delighted that Ireland and Irish executives are playing a full and constructive role in the industry all across our union. Connection and cooperation are key across this industry and across the global community. As we have seen in the last year, we will achieve much more together than apart. I wish you every success in your conference and deliberations today. Thank you very much indeed.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're fortunate to have no less than 2 prime ministers with us for this morning's session. Our next piece is with Erna Solberg, the Prime Minister of Norway. She will be interviewed by Connie Hedegaard, the former Commissioner for Climate Action in the European Commission.
Welcome to Erna Solberg, Norway's Prime Minister since 2013. A woman who held her first political office back in 1979, meaning you have more than 40 years of experience in policy making. And actually, Erna Solberg was one of 40 leaders joining President Biden's summit. And maybe we should start there, Erna Solberg. What was your main takeaway from that huge event?
Well, I think, first of all, we are all very happy that the US is back on track when it comes to international work to cut carbon emissions. It's extremely important. And I think the fact that that the US, what we really have had is a year of a little bit of disappointment in 2020. Very few countries did follow up on the 5-year plan to come up with new NDCs for their by the time limit in February. I think Norway was one of the few Western countries who did. But what we really have seen now is that much more of the more advanced economies are moving ahead. And I think that's the result of not just the summit, but of course, these types of events usually tend to making a decision process before you are making statements. So we saw that Japan came with better and new NDCs, and we see that other countries are following up. And of course, the US is putting up on a bigger leader role than they have had the last 4 years, and that gives an multiple effects. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from it.
But actually, Norway, I mean, yourself did not bring any new things to the table. Why is that?
But because we did put up and this is last year in February, 50 to 55% cut in emissions. So in a way, we were 7 months before the European Union and about the same level as the European Union. I think it depends a little bit on how you count forests. I think we are a little bit above the European Union if we have counted forests the way the European Union do, a country with such much forestry as we have would have had a much lower target. But we were trying to follow because we pushed in Paris for this 5-year review of new indices. So we said we would have tried to be in solidarity with what we were working on in Paris in 2015. But we did put forward a lot of the new technologies that we are working on, trying to push so that we also managed to create both new jobs, but to create technological solutions to lower emissions.
But as a nation that owes its wealth and its position as one of the richest countries in the world to exactly oil and gas, some people could wonder how come, even though you have a lot of hydro, how will you actually decarbonize? What is the main ingredients?
It's extremely important to remember that, yes, Norway has an economy that has been fueled by oil and gas. And I think this, of course, is a dilemma for when we are discussing it. But our consumption is much lower because our own balance of energy is very much based on hydro. And that also have led us to be one of the leading countries on electrification. One of the things we are working on now is, of course, how much of the oil and gas production will be electrified. We think it's our responsibility to cut down on emissions from production of oil and gas, not to cut down on oil and gas production, but the emissions in the production process. That's why we are looking at how we can electrify more. It's become a bigger political issue in Norway these days. But if you look a couple of years back, there was a sort of a joint feeling that we should try as much as possible to electrify all the processes that are in oil and gas production. We, of course, do electrical cars. We have our biggest transformation now is to transform our transport system into a low emission transport system. And if you have looked at the map of Norway, that's a challenge because we can't answer that with trains or public transport because scarcely populated country is dependent on cars. That's why we have an electrical vehicle policy that we've had for some years that now means that more than half of all new cars sold in Norway are electrical. If you look at the hybrid part of that too, I think it's like 80% that are either hybrid or electrical cars, totally low emission cars. We are looking at how we can get the goods transportation system over to either become electrical or at least non-emission, where hydrogen, of course, is an important issue. So we are looking at how, and we are seeing that we need to have charging systems. We need to have we have a very strong economic incentives to buying an electric car in Norway because
that is, of course, also why it has been expensive for the state budget. And some would think, oh, this sounds really, really expensive, and you can only do that if you're a very, very rich oil nation. What is the lessons learned on the electrification on transport in Norway that others could learn from?
Incentives are important, but other countries will go into a totally much more mature car market than we were when we started. You know, when we started buying an electrical car, were usually, the second car in a household. It was small city-oriented cars that you would have not for long transportation with a very, very short range, in fact. So you sort of started at that point. Then, of course, the Tesla revolution came where you could have an expensive and posh car to drive around with much larger range. And now all the car producers are delivering good electrical cars with longer range. And that can be number one car in a family, meaning that you don't need to have a fossil fuel or hybrid car. You can, in fact, only have electrical cars. That's a big change. And it's important to say, at this level we are now with cars. I think it's easier with less incentives for people. Of course, you need some incentives, but smaller incentives than we historically have had. Cars are expensive in Norway. It was looked upon as a luxury good after the Second World War. We have always taxed it high. I think Denmark, in a way, also taxes cars high. But there has been zero tax, not even value-added tax on buying an electrical car. That's very strong incentives. But I believe that we are in a much more mature market. You don't need that strong incentives, but you need some incentives. You have to make it more expensive with fossil fuel cars. And that's the answer. Not to use more subsidies on electrical car, but just saying that the price difference has to be there.
I think that was actually also one of your key messages at the summit that we talked about before, that there must be a high price on carbon. Back in January this year, 8 months before the general elections in Norway, you actually proposed a tripling of the CO2 price to 200 euros per ton when we come to 2030. I could paraphrase Greta Thunberg and say, how dare you?
Well, of course, this is a political discussion. And of course, it's easy to become populistic and tabloid these days into an election campaigning in Norway, saying that we can't do it. We have said at the same time that we will make sure that we are distributing the income and making sure that persons are not feeling this on their personal economy. So we will do tax reliefs and or other systems to make sure that businesses and single persons are getting the amounts back. Of course, especially in the regions of Norway where you have long distances, more challenging, you need stronger cars in the wintertime. All of these is aspects that we have to take into account. But we believe that the only way to move technology forward is to make sure that when you do investment planning, both production companies in different areas, but also the consumer knows that the price will go up. This will not change. It's a big and huge investment for buying and creating new technology.
So the price signal is absolutely key that we get that in place. But also regulation has its role to play here. I know that in Norway, for instance, you use public procurement, very targeted. And I guess that one of the best examples will be shipping, because you also want to electrify ships.
We do public procurement, we do regulations, and we've said in this plan that we delivered in January that we will, there will not be a regulation that all ferries will have to be zero emission ferries in the new bids that will be made in Norway after 2022, that we will on fast transport by sea, we will do the same in 2025, more passengers, smaller passenger ferries. And of course, with our large coastline, this amounts to something, because we have about 200 ferries connecting people to the main transportation system in Norway. And a lot of people are living in areas where you do need to take transportation by sea. That's so we are using public procurement. We are saying that you can, of course, stimulate new technology, and that the public sector should stimulate new technology. We started in 2015 with a program called the Green Shipping Program to start to learn to get both the ones who are ordering, the ship owners, the transportation system, but also the regional authorities, to get them to understand how you can do a bid and how the new technology can function, so that they were good demanders and that they were that they could demand better technologies and lower emissions. And then, of course, we've said that public procurement is extremely important in the beginning. It is more costly, but it does develop new technology. And Norway is the world's 7th largest shipping company. And we are now moving into stimulating the whole global technologies around that. And then you can't do electrification. That's too long distances. Then it's, of course, hydrogen, and it's ammonia that is the solutions. And we are trying to work together with European institutions and others to develop this. But the electrical business is part of that, because producing hydrogen, we will also need electricity for.
But then we have pricing, we have regulation, public procurement, target setting. And as Solberg, as Prime Minister and leader of your party, you belong to sort of the right of center political perspective. And I guess that other European leaders from that political family would say, yeah, but leave it to the market. Is there something in the way we have to act in order to combat climate change as fast as our ambitious targets imply that we must, that will sort of change the way we think about the relation between market and politics?
Well, I think everybody who believes in the market economy also knows that it has its faults, because there's some things you don't price. And if you don't price emissions of carbon, because our climate is a common good, you will get wrong incentives. So I think for everybody who believes in economic stimulus, who believes that you should leave the market, you also need to make sure that you price also that type of emissions. And that's why we say, yes, we will support market-based solutions, but you need to price externalities. And that's what the CO2 emission is. It's an externality that you have to price. And then, of course, sometimes you have to dare to go longer. There are some big technological problems, like the carbon capture and storage program that we have, that the market would not provide by itself. You know, you have to break through new technologies. And I believe that governments have a responsibility to help in breaking those new types of technology, because especially in countries like smaller countries like Norway or other countries, we don't have those big private capital owners that can bear a large program like the one we have on Longship and CCS.
One of the reasons why Norway is as far advanced as you are when it comes to electrification is, of course, your very, very extensive use of hydro-generated electricity. And that is very much dispersed out through your vast country. I wonder if sometimes in the Prime Minister's office, you sit there and think, wow, it is a bit inefficient with these. I guess you have 356 municipalities. I mean, and they all have a say on waste handling, on the hydro plant, on many things. Do we have a dilemma here about the need to be very efficient and think in big scale, and yet still be able to sort of carry citizens and also bring the local democracy on board?
I think this is a dilemma. And of course, it's on the other hand, I think our local municipalities are strongly feeling that they also should work on sustainable solutions for the future. I think there's a large focus on that. But of course, they will also be hard activists if a local business technology is not efficient enough, and they will have problems, and there are challenges. But I believe that local municipalities are, in fact, focusing quite a lot on also how they can make sure that they are doing their best to cut carbon emissions. But knowledge is a challenge, and waste is, of course, one of the areas where municipalities has a large decision, because they run most of the waste plants. We have some extremely ambitious and new waste plants in Norway from the larger cities who are doing an enormous amount of recirculation, doing that. Then we, of course, have a lot of small municipalities. We are trying to get them to work together so that you can have efficiency by working together on a larger scale for the future. And it seems, well, voluntary work is functioning also on this level. But one of the things we have to do is, of course, make sure that we are, which municipalities don't really often like, is when we say you have to tax, you have to use, you have to invest more, and you have to tax, in fact, the users, the ones who are polluting, to make sure that your systems are efficient. Because nobody likes to tax their local citizens or others more.
The last barrier I would like to take up with you here is on skills. I think that in many places throughout Europe, there is this, yes, we know that we need to go from A to B, but how exactly do we sort of skill people for that purpose and reskill and upskill? I remember during the economic crisis, it was said that in Stavanger, the oil capital of Norway, that there were Porsches holding on the park lot outside the job center during these years. There's a huge reskilling and upskilling needed. How are you addressing this?
Well, we do have a reform on upscaling and skills transmission in Norway. I think one of the histories of Norway is, of course, that through every crisis we've had, because we have been a rich country, we have parked people outside the labor market. And they have not been unemployed because we have had a low unemployment, but they have been on different types of schemes for disabilities and others. And we have had a more generous program than others. And I really believe that you are hurting people if you tell a 25-year-old we don't need you in our labor market, or a 40-year-old that we don't need you, you are hurting people. That's why we've said that we have to, in the meeting with climate change and the policy changes that comes from that, digitalization, all of this, we have to work even more on reskilling. We have several programs now working together with the different parts of our economy and the businesses on reskills they need to get their employees more skilled. Then we do have a large scheme for trying to get people to finish skills level after the secondary level, especially now in the Corona crisis, where tourism is hit, where hotels and restaurants are hit, and maybe the lowest paid jobs are more hit than others. We do really need people to finish their education, to go back to school. And we have large programs for that now. But we do need to get the individual motivated. And that's maybe one of the biggest challenges we have.
Okay, so that's why it's important also to really make this a debate that citizens, broadly speaking, want to be part of. So if in conclusion, we are talking about the electric decade, and everybody is sort of coming up with this slogan, the future is electric. It's easy to say, it's difficult to do. So in conclusion, what is your sort of biggest sort of heads up where you see the biggest challenge here for Europe, but also maybe your advice as to how to make sure that if we spoke together 3 or 5 years down the road, that we are actually moving towards that target? What is then your take?
Well, I think the most important areas is to look at all types of transportation, because Norway have had our electric, all of our housing has been hydro-based electric. So we have not been able to cut our emissions through doing different in our energy balance. We have to work on technologies that are mobile, that are functioning otherwise. And I think this is Europe's big challenge in the future. It's not just shifting how you heat your house. It's also to make sure that our transportation systems become more electric. And then the other things we have to do is to work on those parts of businesses where the technology, where you can't replace carbon emissions because it's part of the production process, not an energy balance, but the production process. That's where CCS in Norway on the cement industry, that's why waste plants plants are important for us, because there we don't have a different technology, and that's where we think carbon storage is capture and storage is an answer until we get a totally new technology that can develop these products. Cement production is 7% of emissions in the world.
So it's a whole host of things that we need to do. Are you hopeful that we will manage to do so?
I think one of the most hopeful things is that if you look at how businesses now are allocating, or investors are allocating money to businesses, there is a tremendous change. And I think that's where the big capital comes from. And that's when you also will get the big drive for new technologies. And I think we are in a move that is very different now than we were 3 years ago.
Thank you very much. Prime Minister Solberg, and good luck with your continued endeavors in Norway. Thank you for now.
Thank you.
Very fascinating experiences from Norway with electrification of cars, of ferries, and even planes. Norway is truly taking up the challenge of accelerating in the electric decade. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and privilege to welcome the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Mr. Frans Timmermans.
Prime Minister Solberg, ladies and gentlemen, over a year ago we presented the European Green Deal to a world that was very different to the one that we know today. The health crisis, which is still not over, is followed by the worst economic recession since the Second World War. The pandemic is teaching us a harsh lesson about our fragility as human beings. But it's a lesson we must heed if we are to come out of the crisis stronger and ready to tackle the climate and biodiversity crises already on our doorstep. The Green Deal is our new strategy for sustainable growth based on fairness, innovation, and decoupled from resource use. It is our roadmap for the EU to become climate neutral by 2050 and for addressing the biodiversity crisis. And as we build back our economy, we also need to build back our nature, because forests and oceans are being polluted and destroyed. When we first presented the Green Deal, it was relatively lonely on the world stage. But more than 1 year later, we're joined by many others in this global race to net zero. China, South Korea, South Africa, Japan, and most recently the United States are joining with ambitious commitments of their own. That's great news, because this is a race where we can all win. But we still run the risk of it all slipping through our fingers, of easing back into business as usual simply because it is the comfortable thing to do. Recent IEA figures show that CO2 emissions are already back at pre-pandemic levels. So the urgency of acting on our commitments is high. The EU is setting the stage for a recovery based on green and digital transition. With our new long-term budget and a recovery fund, the EU will have 1.8 trillion euros to bounce back from the crisis and restart the European economy. 30% of those funds must go to climate action, and none of the spending may cause any significant harm. Earlier this month, we found agreement on the European climate law. The law makes meeting our target of at least 55% emissions reductions by 2030 a legal obligation, and is an extra push to set in motion the necessary changes. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no vaccine for the climate or biodiversity crises, but there is a way out. And our launch pad to a better future for our children and our grandchildren is the energy sector. Energy is responsible for 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. There is no credible path to climate neutrality without deep decarbonization of our energy system. This will require an unprecedented investment in clean energy, in renewable power generation, hydrogen production, building refurbishment, electric cars, new train connections, and low-carbon industrial processes. But these investments will pay back and will bring new jobs and a more sustainable market for our goods and know-how overseas. The decarbonization of our energy system will follow two parallel tracks. First, we need to be more energy efficient. Over the next years, Europe will massively invest in building renovation and a better sourcing of heat. We must reduce our energy bills and leave no molecule or electron to waste. EU funds with Next Generation EU are a real opportunity to step up our efforts. Second, we need to move away from fossil fuels. Coal phase-out is already advancing very fast, and it will only accelerate as alternatives are cheaper than ever before. by 2050, the role of gas and oil will be marginal. But fossil fuels need to be replaced. We need to connect new sectors to clean electricity. And, where this is not feasible, we will promote renewable and low-carbon fuels such as hydrogen. Above all, we have to integrate sectors, power generation, buildings, transport and industry, into one energy system. This is in many ways a Herculean task, but it is feasible. Your sector is a crucial partner, as electrification will play a huge role. In 2050, electricity should meet around half of our energy demand. It is 1/4 today. But to get there, the pace of electrification should quadruple already now in the next decade. In transport alone, by 2030, the share of electricity should be 3 times what it is today. In the next 10 years, Europe needs to double its renewable capacity. We will move from 420 gigawatts in 2020 to 840 gigawatts by 2030. We will also need unprecedented investments in grid reinforcement to connect new wind farms, the new fleet of electric cars and electrolyzers to produce renewable hydrogen. This requires more cross-border connections in the EU and with our neighbours, smarter and more digital grids, and a greater role for individual Europeans sharing the self-produced electricity on the grid. So we'll need to jump higher than we've ever jumped before. The good news is that there are also immense opportunities for investments, economic growth and jobs. Making this jump will mean an advancement for everyone in Europe. The scale of the change we will see is comparable to the jump we made when James Watt invented the steam engine. Fossil fuels have been the backbone of Europe's growth since the 18th century. But in this new industrial revolution, renewables are taking over. They already produce the cheapest power humanity has ever seen. Regardless of the energy mix today, that's a pretty good starting point if you ask me. Europe is ready to move beyond commitments and targets. We're now working on delivering the necessary changes. This summer, we will present a number of proposals to meet our 55% emissions reduction target and make our legislative framework fit for 55. We have to shift the whole of our economy into higher gear. So we're leaving no stone unturned. Fit for 55 will align our laws with our ambition. We will strengthen the EU emissions trading system, update the Energy Taxation Directive, and propose new CO2 standards for cars, new energy efficiency standards for buildings, new targets for renewables, and new ways of supporting clean fuels and infrastructure for clean transport. We're also looking at possibly expanding the emissions trading system to new sectors, such as road transport, buildings, and maritime navigation. On top of this, the new carbon border adjustment mechanism will help us prevent carbon leakage instead of outsourcing our emissions. In large part, this package builds on legislation that is tested, proven, and effective in bringing down emissions. Overall, it signals a shift towards stronger carbon pricing across the economy. This will mean a more level playing field for all fuels and ending the relative disadvantage for electricity. We need to make sure that we use our new resources wisely to help build an economy that is socially just and helps the most vulnerable families to benefit from this transition. Ladies and gentlemen, for the Green Deal to succeed, we have to think about our planet and our economy as one system. We can no longer work to fix the climate and let biodiversity and our forests down. We can no longer look at each sector of the economy in isolation. Electricity is the agent of change in all of the big challenges we're now facing. It's a key ingredient and an accelerator for clean transport, for zero-emission buildings, and for low-carbon industrial processes. And not just in Europe. There are immense opportunities to work with our partners, for instance, in Africa. We can make electricity access a universal good and do it well before 2030. Over 600 million people on our sister continent Africa still live without any access to electricity today. So let's think about electrification as our common goal, whatever the starting point. The European power industry has an important role to play, and I'd like to work with you to get these investments going. Our vision for the power sector is a more integrated European economy that is powered by decarbonised electricity and that enables us to live within the boundaries of our planet. This is how we maintain a planet that allows us and future generations to thrive. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to working with you on our common quest towards a green, just and healthy future.
Our last keynote intervention this morning is from Dan Jorgensen, the Danish Minister for Climate, Energy and Utilities.
Hello everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I've looked forward to sharing Denmark's efforts to take the next step into the green transition. Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, has called the climate emergency a race. In many ways, a race is a suitable metaphor for the task ahead of us. The finish line is clear. By 2050, every part of our societies must be decarbonized in order for us to reach climate neutrality. But, contrary to most races, there's no marked path to follow. We simply don't have all the solutions yet. This is why we've set an ambitious sub-goal to cut our emissions in Denmark by 70% by 2030 compared to 1990. We believe that if we set targets we don't really know how to achieve yet, we will force ourselves to make the necessary developments, we will force ourselves to create the new technologies, to find new ways of working together, and to use existing technologies in new and better ways. All of this involves electrification. However, electrifying key sectors such as transport, industry, and heating only makes sense if we commit to renewable energy on a much larger scale than we do today. This means phasing out fossil fuels such as coal and replacing it with renewable energy, such as wind and solar. That is the reason why Denmark is building the world's first energy hubs, one in the Baltic Sea and one in the North Sea, which will be in the shape of an artificial island. The energy hubs will collect wind power from several surrounding new offshore wind farms with 5 gigawatt capacity. Eventually, they can be expanded to reach total capacity of at least 12 gigawatts. That is enough to cover the electricity demand of 12 million European households. Obviously, that is much more than we need in Denmark ourselves. So what's the point? I'll give you 2 reasons why we're doing it. First of all, the energy hubs can connect to other European shores and potentially to other energy hubs established by other countries. This is a fundamental paradigm shift in offshore wind. Instead of a national approach based on regular offshore wind farms sending electricity home to the domestic shores, we want to go beyond national borders. This will allow us to share our green energy resources and thereby help reduce CO2 emissions in the whole of Europe. Secondly, the abundance of wind energy makes green hydrogen possible. If we are to become fully climate neutral by 2050, more renewables is not the only answer. We need new technologies to support sectors hard to abate in the green transformation. Sectors such as heavy industry, heavy transport, we need innovative technical solutions for them. Such a solution is green hydrogen, which will help us solve at least 2 problems. We can store renewable energy for when we need it the most, but we can also convert green hydrogen into green fuels for shipping, aviation, and industries not suitable for direct electrification. I began by saying that the race towards climate neutrality in 2050 comes without a marked path. However, I believe that European legislation can work as a rather good roadmap for governments to follow. Therefore, Denmark suggests an EU target of 45% renewable energy in 2030. This reflects the need for renewable energy for both electrification and green hydrogen, as well as the EU climate target for 2030 by at least 55%. I hope that our governments, the Commission and the European Parliament will support the Danish suggestion for higher ambitions on renewable energy. In order to win the race towards climate neutrality, we need to cooperate on green solutions across sectors, across the public and the private, and across national borders. Thank you.